Half-Life 1 is one of my favorite games of all time. So when a friend of mine recommended I try out this Half-Life mod called Otherworld, I was initially excited. So I go to its ModDB page and see this screenshot. I was actually pretty intrigued. The game looked nothing like what I expected a Half-Life 1 mod to look like. And honestly, I was kind of digging the weird, esoteric, and moody vibe from the screenshot. So I gave the game a download and started playing. After spending dozens of hours making my way through Otherworld, and finally reaching the end, I can confidently say, Otherworld is, without hesitation, the worst experience I've ever had with a game. It was so profoundly unfun and miserable that I actually ended up becoming sort of fascinated with it. It's one of the most memorable games I've ever played, and I've spent a long time thinking about it despite its questionable quality. And that's sort of why I'm making this video, to vent about this little Half-Life mod that nobody has heard of on my little channel that nobody has heard of. I have seen almost nothing posted about this game online. The only thing I could find other than the ModDB page itself was that someone under the name of Etalikor made and posted a full walkthrough to the game on YouTube. So I at least have confirmation I'm not the only person to ever beat it. So shout out to that guy. Hold on, this is post-editing goob. I'm only learning this after writing the script, but apparently Vinny from Vinesauce played this game for a short bit? Yeah, he only made it in a few levels before quitting. Probably for the best. Anyways, let's dive right into it. Otherworld, as described on its ModDB page, is a puzzle mod. I don't agree with this description, but we can talk more about that later. The gameplay in Otherworld is very straightforward, theoretically. You're spawned into a level and you need to navigate it to find and collect all of the, what I'll call key blocks in a level, which then unlocks the exit. This is the core gameplay loop that the game uses all the way through its runtime. It sounds simple, and yeah, at first the game starts out innocent enough. Just grab the keys obviously strewn about the level and proceed to the exit. The game then starts throwing platforming puzzles at you. At this point, my opinion of the game was probably at its highest. I love Half-Life, and I'm a big fan of the source engine and its movement. I'm also a big fan of 3D platformers in general. A sort of platforming-focused Half-Life mod was right up my alley. Early on, the game even forces you to learn and use an obscure Half-Life movement tech, where while strafing you sort of flick your mouse in the direction you want to go, and then jump mid-flick to get extra distance on the jump. That's pretty cool, and throughout most of World 1, which I'll just dub the Red Zone for obvious reasons, I was pretty into the game. Though, looking back, there were definitely some things that stood out as red flags. For one, the game introduces these exclamation point blocks, which do this when you touch them. You disappear, and it says, quote, "You're trapped, please try again." Yeah, so the verbiage here actually matters. Your character doesn't die, but instead they're just trapped forever. Somewhere off-screen, presumably, I don't know. Literally all this distinction means is that if you get trapped, you can't hit any key to reload the latest save. Instead, you have to manually reload whatever save you want to go to. This makes it just a more annoying version of dying. It serves the same exact purpose, but it's harder to reload your save. I just don't get it. Why have this trapped mechanic in the first place? It's literally the same as dying, but just more annoying since you have to manually reload. Also, funnily enough, this is the mechanic that made Vinny just quit outright the first time it happened to him.
All right. I think we can safely move on to Half-Life Vodka now.
But Vinny lacks the willpower that I have, the absolute determination to just have a completely miserable time in Otherworld. Also, I have to talk about this now because it's just so bizarre to me. Occasionally, usually every few levels, you'll reach a level exit. And instead of instantly teleporting you to the next level, it'll instead just throw some text on screen commanding you to, quote, "Enter in console, map 258275. And the only way to get to the next level is to open your game console and type map 258275. Why is it like this? Look, I don't have any experience in modding Half-Life 1. Maybe there's some good reason for this that I don't know of, some engine limitation. But also, I kind of doubt that. I've played a good few other Half-Life 1 mods, and I've never been expected to manually enter the map ID in the console. It's actually really annoying too, since the message only stays up for a short while before disappearing entirely. So, if you miss it, sorry bud, gotta do the level again I guess. Oh, and if you accidentally type the wrong map number into the console, you're going to the main menu. I hope you had a save at the end of that level, because otherwise you're probably going to have to do the whole thing again. Early on, this whole thing isn't really that big of a deal, since this kind of level transition only happens every couple of levels, so it's really not that frequent. But in later parts of Otherworld, there are sections where every single level expects you to do this to get to the next, and it just becomes really aggravating. Anyway, that's about all I had to say on the first world in Otherworld, aka the Red Zone. Despite the frustrating oddities of the game starting to show, it's still generally enjoyable due to its simplicity and focus on platforming. But World 2. World 2 is where things start to go to shit. In Otherworld, a new world means a new color scheme, and usually some new obstacles. World 2 is very, very blue, and quickly introduces some interesting new mechanics. First is the teleport, which is a block with this red arrow on top of it. Stepping on it teleports you somewhere. There's no way to tell where it'll go, but a specific teleport will always take you to the same exact spot. This isn't so bad, and really only requires that you remember where each teleport takes you, though it can get a little confusing in levels with a lot of teleports. As for the other new mechanic, and I use that word loosely, I'll just show you an example of it in action. So yeah, breakable blocks. These blocks will crumble as soon as you touch them, whether you touch them from above or from the side, whatever. Otherworld uses these all the time as, essentially, a trap. You step on a breakable block, it gives way, and you die. I could go on and try to explain why this sucks so badly, and why it is so very annoying, but instead of trying to verbally explain, let me just show you the level 2-4. Let me just start by saying fuck this level. It's exactly what it looks like. It's just a huge grid of blocks, and most of them will break on you. There are 3 keys that you must get before booking it to the exit, and there is one specific path that you have to take. Any block that's not on that path will break, and the only way to find out which blocks will break and which ones won't is just trial and error. Remember this term. It'll come back. A lot. I hope I don't need to explain even more in depth why this level sucks shit, but yeah, it's just trial and error, there's no skill involved, it's no problem solving, just monotonous trial and error for the sake of it. And if that wasn't bad enough, yeah, let's throw some teleports in here too, why not? It was at this point in my first Otherworld playthrough where I decided that actually no, I think this game sucks and I kind of hate it. Like, I actually do not know what would compel someone to make a level like this. What part of this is fun? It just sucks, point blank, I don't get it. This level probably took me over half an hour on my first playthrough, and it was just as fun as it sounds. And this level perfectly shows off my issue with breakable blocks in Otherworld. They're basically exclusively used like this. Just a cheap trap to kill you once and get you to reload the save. This happens so much throughout all of Otherworld that it almost feels like one of the core design tenets of the game is, haha, it's funny, when you step on a block, it breaks and you die. It's not fun, it doesn't add anything to the game other than tedium and many unfair feeling deaths. Anyway, if the game wasn't entering a downward spiral fast enough for you, don't worry. The very next level introduces another fan-favorite Otherworld mechanic, invisible blocks. More specifically, invisible blocks that you are made to platform on. In their introduction level, they're not so bad, as you get these arrows on the ground pointing generally to where you can find the invisible platforms. And even though the arrows don't show the entire path, you can sort of intuit where the rest of the platforms will be. But don't worry, that's all thrown out the window in every level that comes afterward. For example, here's a level where an arrow will point in the general direction you have to go. But as for where the actual blocks are, yeah, they're here. Now, you might be thinking, how are you supposed to know they were invisible blocks at these specific spots? That's right, it's our old friend, trial and error. The only thing more fun than guessing which blocks will break is guessing where the fucking blocks even are. Pick a direction, throw your body into the abyss, and hope that you hit something, because who knows where those pesky platforms are. If my tone of voice wasn't indicative, this might be my least favorite mechanic in all of Otherworld. Again, mechanic in quotes. It's very much like the breakable blocks, but just turned up to 11. Just trial and error, load save state, leap of faith, load save state, leap of faith, rinse and repeat. And don't worry, these invisible blocks are prevalent throughout many of the game's 67 levels. Like seriously, this shit does not stop showing up. I would hazard a guess and say it's in more levels than not. And believe it or not, the worst part of all of this is that going into a new level, you have no idea if the solution will involve invisible platforms or not. This might not sound like too big of a deal, but let me explain. Like I said before, in Otherworld you have to collect all of the key blocks in order to unlock the exit. One thing I didn't mention is that there can be any number of key blocks in a level. This means there could just be 1, or there could be 5, and there's no way of knowing until you actually collect the last key and see the exit unlock. This little detail actually ends up letting invisible blocks sneak into a lot of levels. You might start a level and it seems innocuous enough. Maybe you find 4 keys in pretty well hidden places, but you notice the exit still isn't unlocked. You scour the entire level over and over, but you still can't find what you assume is the final key. And what do you know? The reason you can't find the last key is because the solution involves doing a completely blind jump around this corner onto an invisible block. The only way to get this key is by taking this invisible path that the player has no way of knowing exists. But worse than that, the player has no way of knowing this key exists without stepping on this invisible platform. This happens so much in Otherworld. It'd be a different situation if we as the player knew the key was up on this roof. If that was the case, we'd at least have an idea of where to look for these BS mechanics. But as it stands, Otherworld very frequently gives you absolutely no hint as to where the keys are, resulting in the player having to go to these absurd extremes in order to find things. Check every single block to see if they're breakable. Jump at every single empty space to see if there's an invisible block path. This can spiral out of control so hard that some levels towards the end can take literal hours to complete, just because there's no other way to find these keys than to just sit down and try literally everything. It sucks, they suck, I hate invisible blocks. As for the rest of World 2, or the Blue Zone, it doesn't really get any better. There's some more fun breakable block levels, including one that is dangerously close to one we've seen before. Except now, instead of only 8 blocks to choose from at any given location, there's 9. That's cool. Moving on to World 3, the Green Zone, I have to address the elephant in the room. You might have noticed it by now, and it's completely unironically my favorite part of Otherworld. The sound effects. All, or almost all, of the sound effects in Otherworld are completely original and made specifically for the mod. The sound of footsteps, taking damage, falling, jumping, they all have unique sounds, and they are interesting, to put it mildly. I just love these sound effects because honestly, I feel like they kind of pair well with the surreal and abstract visual design of the game. And because the game has no music, at least the version I'm playing, these sound effects are all you'll be listening to throughout the entire game. And look, maybe it's a bit of Stockholm Syndrome, but I feel like these sound effects lend the game some amount of character that it wouldn't otherwise have. I bring all this up because I would like to introduce World 3's new mechanic, water. Yeah, that stuff. And just you wait, the best part is what it sounds like. Yeah, I love this sound effect. It's just so perfectly stupid. Is forever engraved into my brain, and I am better for it. Anyway, water works about as you expect. You can swim in it, you can drown if you're underwater too long. The signature Otherworld twist here is that sometimes you'll come across floating blocks of water that look like this. You can see the surface of the water, sure, but where's the actual body of water? Well, even though it's fully invisible, it's about here. Now, you might be asking, if it's invisible, how do you know how far down the body of water goes? Well, you don't. Surely you didn't think we were done with that whole trial and error thing. But really though, it's not that annoying to deal with, since unlike the invisible blocks, you can at least always see the water surface. Overall, I'd say the water in Otherworld is pretty standard and not that bad. The most annoying part about it is the intense red fog that you get while underwater, which can make it hard to look for things in large underwater environments. World 3 also introduces ladders, and the yellow World 4 introduces the weirder but functionally identical squiggly line ladder. These are fine. Not that Half-Life 1's ladders were ever particularly popular, but whatever. They're functional and not that frustrating. Aside from, of course, the levels with fake ladders, because of course there are fake ladders. How do you know which ladder is fake? Yeah, I don't know, I wonder. Shout out to the ladder climbing sound though, it's pretty good. Also in World 4 was yet another watershed moment for my hatred of this game. I was going around this level and I could not find any way to the exit. I could see it was on a little floating platform just out of reach, along with what I presumed was the final key. I spent a good while looking for any way to it, even checking for invisible blocks, but to no avail. Eventually though, I found this. Yeah, the teleport to the end was hidden in this completely random breakaway wall. I don't think I can properly express how much this sucks. It's not just that the solution to this particular puzzle was in this lame breakaway wall that I had no way of knowing existed. The worst part is that from here on out, now that I've seen that the game is willing to put key items and puzzle solutions inside of these random breakaway walls, now I have to always be on the lookout for these. From this point forward, if you're walking down a hallway and not rubbing your grimy little player model against that wall, you're playing the game wrong, because who knows, there could be a key in there, or a teleport, or the exit. You have no way of knowing. And spoilers, this is anything but infrequent. In future levels, very often will important items, mostly keys, be hidden in walls like this. So this is now just part of the Otherworld gameplay experience. Get used to it. And again, the worst part of all of this is, just like the invisible blocks, there's no way to know how many of these are in any given level. A level could look super simple with 5 keys obviously in eyesight, but for all you know, there's 10 more hidden inside the walls. There's no way to know until you check. I still can't believe they finally found a different use for the breakable blocks, and this is it. Also, speaking of reusing shitty mechanics in slightly different but still shitty ways, the invisible blocks are now being used as invisible walls. Here's a level where you have to get onto this roof, but it's surrounded by invisible walls. That is, except for one specific spot where it isn't. How do you find that one specific spot? It's trial and error, of course. And look, if you think I'm getting repetitive saying the same thing about trial and error over and over again, man, just imagine playing Otherworld. It's basically all the game knows. And from this point, the problem just gets worse and worse. Let me show you this fan favorite level, where you start in a room with 2 teleports, and both teleports take you to an identical room. The only way out is to guess the correct 8-length sequence, and if you choose wrong, you're teleported back to the very start. That's pretty obnoxious, though I will say this is made more bearable by the fact that you can spray walls to mark rooms that you've been in before. Oh, and if that wasn't exhausting enough, that's actually not the end of the level. Once you're done, there's a whole nother challenge. This time, the place is flooded, and you have to guess the correct 6-length sequence. Cool! Also, if you get the sequence wrong here, you are actually soft-locked completely. The game even tells you to not save during this segment. And the cherry on top is that this level has 4 different keys hidden inside the walls. So even if you finally make it through this hellhole level, you make it to this elevator, you go up, and you see, whoops, it looks like there's still more keys for you to get. Better restart and try again. Obviously this level is terrible, but to be honest, it's not even that far from your average Otherworld level. And the further in you go, the bolder the levels get. The more and more time it demands of you, not for the sake of learning any skill or getting better, no, just for the sake of another frustrating experiment where you're the subject and the test is to see how much menial, obviously trial and error bullshit you're willing to put up with before Alt F4ing and doing literally anything else with your time. Really, it reminds me a lot of rage games, stuff like Cat Mario, or I Want to Be the Guy. As the name of the genre implies, these games are basically built to make the player rage, oftentimes using largely unfair traps, with the player using trial and error to make it through. And usually, they're pretty self-aware about what they're doing. They kind of relish in the unfair deaths, to the point of absurdity. I mean, just look at this death from I Want to Be the Guy. Now, this all sounds sort of familiar, right? The reliance on unfair traps, the emphasis on trial and error, but I don't think I can call Otherworld a rage game, because I don't think it's trying to be. Sure, many elements of its design are patently unfair, but it doesn't come with the same wink wink nudge nudge that I would expect from a game deliberately trying to make the player angry. It just doesn't feel malicious, right? Even at one part in the game, pretty far in, if you make it past a particularly difficult jump, probably the hardest in the entire game up to that point, text pops up saying, "I want to meet you. You are awesome." Which just reads so sincerely, right? If you look in the game's README, there's a hints and tips section. Some of them read, quote, "Forgot one key? Remember, you have to search every box on many levels to find out every place." Or, quote, "Draw a map and check every block. It helps a lot more than you think." Again, to me, it reads pretty sincerely. Not like the game's trying to make you mad, it just happens to be a game where checking every single block on every single map is part of the expected gameplay loop. Another reason I think this game is playing it straight is that it is so long. Like I said before, there are over 67 levels in Otherworld, and a lot of them are pretty long and usually convoluted. Mechanics are steadily introduced throughout, and even as late as the final world, new concepts are still just being thrown in to keep things fresh. Real effort was put into this mod, and it shows. If it was intended to just be a joke or a troll mod, they could have stopped after World 2. But it just keeps going, and honestly, I kind of respect that. And I think to me, that's sort of the essence of why I find Otherworld so intriguing and so mystifying. How could someone make a game that induces so much rage without it being designed to? Basically what I'm saying is that Otherworld is what I will now call an accidental rage game. And it fascinates me. How does someone make a game this tedious, this frustrating to play, completely unintentionally? It's honestly kind of astounding. Also, to go back to the I Wanna Be the Guy comparison, I think one of the reasons I find the insta-kill deaths in I Wanna Be the Guy less frustrating than in Otherworld is because there's kind of a slapstick humor to these deaths in I Wanna Be the Guy. I mean, Otherworld's breakable blocks were pretty funny the first few times it happened, but the joke gets old pretty fast. In I Wanna Be the Guy, there's at least a ton of variety and effort put into these insta-kill traps that keeps them entertaining in a way that Otherworld doesn't. Okay, so I've done a lot of shitting on the game up until now, but I don't want to be completely unfair to it. Surprisingly, there are a lot of cool elements in Otherworld. First and most obviously, a lot of the standard platforming fair stuff is actually pretty solid. In World 5, aka the Black Zone, the game starts using Half-Life's trip mines in various ways. Generally, I'm a sucker for any section where you have to Mission Impossible your way through a bunch of tripwire lasers. It's just a genuine test of your Half-Life platforming chops and how well you can control your aerial momentum. Otherworld actually does this quite a bit after the trip mines are introduced, and I'm always a sucker for it. Not only that, but it also hit me with a cool new use of the tripwires. You actually have to platform on top of the tiny tripwires themselves, which is something I had never even considered before, and it actually took me a bit to figure it out. But again, this is cool. And actually doing the platforming is difficult but rewarding. Good stuff. I want to say that World 5 in general is actually kind of a high point for Otherworld, aside from World 1 obviously. And even then, I still wouldn't consider it good in a traditional sense, because a lot of the other issues I've talked about are still present in World 5, but World 5 introduces moving blocks, which are basically only used for interesting platforming segments. It also introduces these timed buttons, which usually extend a platform for some limited amount of time. These are almost exclusively used to create a little time trial section where you have to navigate through an obstacle course before the time runs out, which is pretty cool. Except, of course, when there's invisible block platforming in the middle of your time trial, but what can you do? Another neat thing the Otherworld will sometimes do is take advantage of the fact that when you land on a key block, you don't take any fall damage. Some levels will use this and force you to land on top of key blocks unless you want to die to fall damage, which I think is pretty cool. Again, really anything with a platforming focus is pretty well done here. And it's a shame too, because this style of content is so sparse. Anytime it shows up is a massive breath of fresh air, but even in some of the best levels with the most focus on platforming, there'll still be some element of bullshit lurking in the shadows. Either a key hidden in a wall, some invisible platforms, or maybe some breakaway floors. It just permeates through the entire game. Let's move on to our next world, World 6. Technically, this world's color theme is white, but it uses a combination of all previous world colors, and in the same vein, it uses mechanics from all the previous worlds as well, combining them into this huge shit show of a world. You may also notice that the levels in World 6 are fucking massive. This, unfortunately, is a trend that continues for the rest of the game. And as a result, I'd say World 6 and World 7, which is the final one, is where Otherworld hits peak dumpster fire. All of the worst parts of Otherworld, the invisible blocks, the random breakaway blocks, the random teleport blocks, not only are they present in World 6 and 7, and arguably more common, the mundanity they present is just compounded by these huge worlds. You still have to check every single wall to see if it's hiding a key, but now there's just so many more walls. There are still random invisible platforms that you have to be trial and error checking for, but since the levels are so much bigger, it's even more of a chore to find them. I can't overstate how ludicrously big some of these levels are. Even if you know exactly what you're doing, World 6 and 7 combined still take longer than Worlds 1 through 5 do. And that's if you know exactly what to do. If you know where every single floating platform is, every single hidden key is. Speaking of keys, I forgot to mention that not only are these levels much larger, they also have, on average, way more keys to collect than previous levels do, which just makes the slog so much worse. These levels took me so long on my first playthrough. Each of these levels took at least an hour, if not more. It's just miserable. Anyway, back to World 6. It does introduce a new mechanic. These pushable physics blocks start to show up, and I might describe these as the last good thing Otherworld ever does. They're pretty simple and pretty sparsely used, but they're used to pretty good effect in some levels. I mean, hey, pushing blocks around is a staple of puzzle games for a good reason. Pretty hard to get wrong. I particularly like this level that's just a huge sea with a bunch of pushable blocks, and you have to assemble your own bridge across and to specific key points. Though honestly, at this point in Otherworld, I think it's just nice to see a level that has an immediately identifiable goal. And to no one's surprise, World 6 also contains some of the worst invisible block platforming in the game. Like, just look at this shit. Why? Last and maybe least is World 7, coming in with a stunning pink theme. World 7's whole deal is these turrets that'll continuously fire at you when in line of sight. Since Otherworld is a puzzle game with none of that combat stuff, there's no way to fight back, so you kinda just have to coexist with these little monstrosities. Sometimes the dev feels enough pity for you to slap down some of these health kits, but other times you're just on your own, leaving you to lean on old reliable, quick load. But really though, I don't really have a super big issue with the turrets. The main issue is that they're not really used in interesting ways. In most levels, they're just kind of there. There's one level I can think of where it seems like you're supposed to get the turrets to break some of these breakable walls, but you can also just walk into them instead, which I've already been conditioned to do anyway. So most of the time, the turrets are just a way to get you to die and reload slightly more often, which I've also already been mentally numbed to anyway. World 7 also has the rare honor of introducing two mechanics in a single world, with the second of them being these slippery ice blocks that coincidentally also look identical to a regular block. You can't build momentum at all while standing on them, so you're left to either jump onto them with some speed already, or do some air strafing to build up speed. These are used in like 3 levels total, so I don't really have that much to say about them. Or I wouldn't have that much to say about them if literally 20 seconds into the level they're first introduced in, the game didn't also introduce invisible ice blocks, where you have to chain together a bunch of completely blind jumps without stopping. It's actually comical how quickly the game introduced a vaguely interesting new mechanic and then incinerated any and all hope that I had for it by defaulting back to Otherworld's obscene fascination with trial and error. All that said, I will give a shout out to this cool section that combines the tripwires from earlier and the ice. It's pretty cool. Otherworld's penultimate level, titled The End of Otherworld, is supposed to be this cool little homage to everything you've gone through so far, with each of the previous worlds getting its own little section showcasing its unique mechanics. And in any other game, I would think this is a really cool inclusion, but in Otherworld, it just dredges up many, many bad memories. And for Otherworld's final curveball, the very last level is jarringly set in this realistic setting. You're in some Black Mesa-esque area with a really, really loud helicopter hovering nearby. You meander about for a bit, get shot at by this guard, and then you eventually jump towards the helicopter, ending Otherworld. Well, not before Otherworld gets one last fuck you in there with this breakable floor that soft locks you. Even in its final moments, Otherworld just couldn't help itself. My absolute favorite part of Otherworld is right here in the final credits, where Dennis G50, which is the lead developer of the game, leaves us with one final comment. Hope you had fun, accompanied by this disappointed looking emoticon. It's really funny. So, that's Otherworld. A very bizarre ending to a very bizarre mod. Even though I had finished it about 5 months after playing it off and on, I wasn't quite satisfied. I had so many questions about what the creator, Dennis G50, was thinking when he made these levels. I felt like I was missing something. So, I reached out. Despite the mod coming out in 2010, a whole 13 years ago as of recording, using some ancient contact info, I went ahead and messaged him, not really expecting a response. And, after a couple of months, there was no response, just radio silence. Until, eventually, to my surprise, he did actually reply, and he sent a lot. It was honestly an eye-opening response in terms of how I viewed the game, so I'll go over some of the more interesting things he talked about. Dennis starts his response by saying, quote, "Whoa, Goob1155, I don't know how to congratulate you, XD. Thank you for beating my first weird and horrible attempt making my first video game, for real." One thing he brought up is that his game was loosely based off of Kula World, which is a PlayStation 1 puzzle platformer that looks like this. You can definitely see where Otherworld pulled inspiration from, in terms of the blocky aesthetic, gathering keys, and the platforming. To me, one of the most enlightening things Dennis wrote was this, quote, "You can find weird ideas in my mod too when it comes to the game design, the cryptic, unexplained shit, or the invisible platforms, which are obviously annoying. Then, I made no hints in the initial release. I remember changing a bit of that in the later versions after hearing the negative feedback. We didn't let some people playtest our levels, let alone having critical friends, so we couldn't tell what and when we're doing wrong. It is one of the reasons why it's so difficult. Like you're playing a Milan's Secret Castle game for the Nintendo Entertainment System." This essentially confirmed my suspicions. He wasn't trying to make a mod that provokes this negative response from the player. After all, he had tried to adjust some of the more frustrating aspects of the game after hearing that negative feedback. Also, this comparison to Milan's Secret Castle, which like he said is a game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, is actually fairly apt. The game has a reputation for being extremely difficult and frustrating, with one of its most unique and frustrating features being the inclusion of breakable blocks, ones that will often have key items hidden behind them, very similar to the ones you see in Otherworld. Anyway, there's another interesting thing that Dennis sent in his reply, but first I have to clarify something. I said earlier that there's no music in the game, but that's not entirely true. In the game's README, there was a download link to what would have been the Otherworld soundtrack. However, when I had gotten the game, the download link was already outdated and broken, leaving me to play it in silence. So naturally, when I reached out to Dennis, I asked if he still had the soundtrack somewhere, and if he could share it, and luckily enough, he did. Turns out, it's mostly a scattered collection of songs by various musicians that I hadn't personally heard of, names like Skaven, Rickman, and DJ Bricks. Though it appeared that 2 songs were made specifically for Otherworld, titled Self-Made 1 and Self-Made 2, though there's no given artist. I think they're pretty neat and would have fit super well into Otherworld. And if you're interested in what they sound like, well, you're listening to Self-Made 1 right now. While reading his reply, it becomes pretty clear that Dennis has some regrets about how Otherworld turned out, due in part to the troubles described earlier, but also because this was Dennis's first real foray into making a substantial game. Even during development, Dennis wasn't happy with how things were turning out. In his email, he says that towards the end of development, he had more or less given up on Otherworld, and he saw it as, quote, hopeless. That's pretty depressing, honestly, though in a way, I feel like this makes Otherworld more impressive. Despite Dennis feeling disappointed with how the game was turning out, he still powered through and finished it, even pushing out patches later on in an attempt to make the game better, or remove bad levels, etc. Which does mean the version I played was apparently the enhanced version. Makes me wonder just how bad the levels he removed were. Regardless, the fact that he stuck around for 2 full years after release in order to improve his game is pretty admirable. Some other noteworthy things Dennis mentioned were that apparently there might have even been a multiplayer Otherworld prototype floating around at some point, though even Dennis admits it wasn't very good. And I can't seem to find any releases for it today, so I guess it never came out. Anyway, I'm super grateful that Dennis responded after all these years at all, and gave me at least a little bit of closure to my confusion around Otherworld. Dennis ends his email to me by saying, quote, "It is so surreal to me that people do enjoy this weird and embarrassing creation. Thank you for playing and beating it." So, with all this added context, I can't help but feel a bit sad that this is how Otherworld turned out. You can tell that this was something that he'd spent a lot of time working on. From what Dennis has stated online, the game took around 9 months to make, which for a mod is a pretty substantial chunk of time. Not to mention the 2+ years of post-release updates he was putting out. So, after all of this, what do I make of Otherworld? Well, especially with everything I learned about the game after I beat it, the added context explains a lot. Otherworld is what happens when an amateur game designer just kind of goes at it, throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, criticisms be damned. And it turns out most of what stuck was trial and error. If there's one thing Otherworld has going for it, it's the game's ideas. The trip mine platforming, the time trial sections, the physics puzzles, the elevators. Even though in the end, most are overshadowed by Otherworld's more annoying elements, ultimately, I have to respect the ambition Dennis had in including so many unique and interesting ideas. It makes Otherworld, at the very least, an interesting game, both to play and to talk about. Regardless, I stand by what I said at the start of the video. Otherworld is the worst experience I have ever had with a game. But, despite that, I'm glad I played it. It's a unique window into the mind of one random amateur mod developer in 2008, warts and all. And for all of its issues, it's definitely not an experience I'll be forgetting anytime soon. But before we finish up, there's one more thing that Dennis included in his reply that I wanted to showcase, an old trailer for Otherworld. I don't really have much to add to it, I just think it's pretty cool, so here it is.